Welcome to Exploring AI Matters. This podcast series, previously known as Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, will continue to appear in the ABA series to the extent that. In addition, all of the episodes, old and new, will now appear under our new podcast name, Exploring AI Matters. Thank you.
Modern computing theory and practice emerged from Western war efforts during the years from 1939 to 1945. One challenge not solved during the war was weather prediction, which remained an art, slow, manual, and unreliable. One of the first projects funded by the Army Air Corps at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, where an early computer was under construction, was an effort initiated by John von Neumann in 1946 for weather prediction. Predicting the weather continues to be of immense economic and strategic value. Detailed knowledge of current weather conditions in many places around the world holds particular value for the U.S. Air Force. Hello, I am Charles Palmer, a computer scientist.
And I am Roland Trope, a national security lawyer. We are your hosts for this episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence.
In addition, we have two more hosts.
Hello, I'm Amma Adams, a national security lawyer.
And I'm Mark Donner, a computer scientist.
Each episode will be led by two of us, with the others adding impromptu questions and comments as the spirit moves them.
Today, we are delighted to discuss U.S. Air Force-funded weather research at MIT with Major Andrew Bowne, the Chief Legal Counsel of the Air Force MIT AI Accelerator. Major Bowne is a judge advocate in the U.S. Air Force. In addition to his extensive legal credentials, Major Bowne is a PhD candidate in artificial intelligence at the University of Adelaide in Australia. The views presented are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent those of the Department of the Air Force. Andy, since you've said we can call you that, could you tell us why the Air Force is so interested in weather?
Sure, Roland. So imagine how different the world would be if militaries throughout history were able to predict the weather better. How would that affect the D-Day landings or the Dunkirk evacuations? And of course, it's still a major factor from really tactical decisions on when to fly or not to fly, the operational decisions that affect entire theaters, even strategic decisions, as we're seeing now with climate change. So for the Air Force, weather modeling is used in just a vast variety of different mission areas. Aviation weather obviously comes to mind, and that comes into play for forecasting whether it's at terminal or en route. Humanitarian disaster response applications like monitoring of in forecasting fires, maritime applications, tracking severe weather for public safety, combat search and rescue, space launch. The list just goes on and on. So weather's really always been important to military operations, and it continues to be a very important factor today.
Well, something that's been puzzling me as we've been thinking of this episode, I remember when the first weather satellites went up, and I think a lot of us think, well, if satellites can photograph small objects on the ground, monitor what's going on in cities, why is it they can't just tell us what the weather is? Why do we need to forecast it when the satellites are up there looking at it?
So that's a really challenging problem. And it does seem to be something that would be easy to do, but there's a couple of factors that make it difficult. We are all familiar with weather forecasting. The concept that you just talked about, Roland, is what we call weather nowcasting. It's really how do you get that short-term, on-the-spot identification of what the weather patterns are going to look like in the place that you're concerned about. And so what I just described are really the goal. There's various levels of and layers to that problem. One is the type of data that we're receiving. It's coming from all sorts of different sensors. Some of them are ground-based, like radar sensors, and sometimes radar is going to operate in other locations. It could be satellite-based. And where we get that weather and where those sensors are actually pulling data from is not actually as comprehensive as many people might believe. And so there's areas of the world that just lack that sensor data. And I'll remind everybody, I'm not a meteorologist. I'm the legal counsel for this research team, but I do get a chance to work with some fantastic meteorologists, both at the Air Force and then at MIT and Lincoln Laboratory. And so what I learned from them is that the problems that meteorologists have are often from the data. There's also weather is just a hard problem. It's unpredictable, and we're trying to predict it. And so when we're trying to forecast it, it's going to be a challenge. We see that all the time. We take for granted the fact that we get a pretty accurate depiction, even as far as like 10 days or 2 weeks out on many weather models. And usually the best we could do is complain about it if the forecast miss a couple of inches of rain here or there. Maybe it was a little bit warmer than the weatherman said it was going to be on the local news or on your app on your cell phone. But as was alluded to earlier, that's a relatively recent phenomenon that we're able to have any indication of what the weather is going to be. And now we're trying to get to the point where we could actually understand what the weather is now in a given location.
As I'm listening to you, I'm beginning to wonder, which kind of weather are we talking about? Are we talking about weather on the ground that the Air Force is interested in? Weather at, mission altitude, whatever that happens to be? What kind of weather is the Air Force really interested in?
Yeah, all of it. And for different reasons. So the Air Force has a very wide mission area. And so we have things that operate on the ground and we have things that operate in the air. And with the Department of the Air Force, we also have the Space Force. And so that's a whole nother factor. And all of those mission areas have different and distinct weather problems that need to be addressed. And so even in flight, yeah, of course, we're going to want to understand what the weather is at various altitudes, not just at a particular one. And the mission may call for a pilot to operate on various ceiling levels of altitude. But we also want to understand what it's going to be like, where they're going to land. That's important. Or if there's an airdrop or other mission necessities that require some sort of activity by the air crew in the air, where they're at that point, that weather is going to matter. It's going to matter what type of equipment is used, how a C-17 or basically one of our large cargo planes, how we're going to set up the payload, what we're going to actually use on the plane. That weather impacts all those decisions.
That's really helpful. I should mention that there's recently been a flight from New York to New Zealand, which, because they misjudged and mismodeled the headwinds, they're having to take fewer people, and this was something they thought they had nailed down. So now
sure.
That we put in context,
it affects like fuel consumption and approach and how long you're in the air. So it's a big problem.
Modeling and prediction of weather has been an interest of both computer scientists and Defense Department thinkers for at least 3/4 of a century. Can you give us a sort of an overview as to what progress has been made at that time and what progress you think we might be making in the near future? Call it foreseeable or forecasting.
So the really big noteworthy advancements are coming from what we call hardware-based solutions. And so radar and satellite are really making up the majority of the sensor data that we're getting in that time that you just described. And so in those decades, since radar has been able to be used by meteorologists, and then later on as weather satellites have been able to be used, and we're starting to see really unique ways that satellites are being used as well for weather and for climate also. That's going to be the state of the art for weather for many decades. Recently, we're starting to be able to apply artificial intelligence applications to helping model weather. We talk about weather prediction and weather forecasting. Well, what does machine learning do really, really well? It helps us predict based on the data that it experiences. So basically, looking in the past at what patterns and identifying patterns or outliers and being able to extrapolate upon that historic data to predict what we might see later on. And so while hardware really dominated a lot of the advancements in the several decades before now, we're starting to see algorithmic advancements that are really starting to make meteorology a very relevant and very cool field to study at this point.
Can you give us a sense as to what the improvements have been? In other words, are you able to forecast more accurately over longer periods, or are you able to do the nowcasting more accurately?
So a little bit of both. And a lot of that comes down to the types of models that we're using, the types of really powerful neural networks that are being used in order to take all that data and come up with algorithms that are going to be really good at predicting, both for longer term and also for the very short term, which is really hard to do. But there's also just collecting data. And as I said before, a lot of the data that we have historically relied on has come from sensors that are disproportionately placed in areas of really kind of urban centers or highly populated areas, or kind of the more affluent countries are going to have weather radar and have the satellites that are going to be providing that really rich data in the format that it needs to be in. So including like the time series that you could actually be able to come up with a algorithmic prediction and a model for that forecast. We're now able to start looking through that sensor data and piece it together with other existing sensors in something that's called a global synthetic weather radar. And so that's really kind of the near-term advancement, is being able to have basically fill in the blanks where we're missing an actual sensor and predict what is going to be there using synthetic radar, using basically multimodal sensor data. So other signal that are able to be received from various sensors can be used to support the predictions that these models are making.
This is fascinating. I mean, weather modeling is one of the toughest applications we've ever tried with computers. And you've mentioned AI already and its application. One of the keys to AI is, of course, that data thing that you keep mentioning. How are you obtaining the data? And I assume it's mostly public data. There's probably some fun stuff in there too. How do you know if it's any good?
Yeah. So a couple parts of that question. So it is public data. So a little background on my organization. It's as you heard in the intro, it is a mouthful. It's the Department of the Air Force, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Artificial Intelligence Accelerator. Essentially what that is a collaboration between the Department of the Air Force and MIT. And through that partnership also with Lincoln Lab, we kind of get from both angles, the fact that they're a federally funded research and development center, as well as an extension of the MIT campus. And so that kind of three-pronged collaboration between the Air Force, MIT, and Lincoln Lab is what makes up the AI Accelerator. And we focus on fundamental research, which essentially means it's research for the public good. It's not going to be basically, it's R&D that isn't going to be restricted by ITAR and other Export Control Act. And so the whole idea is that it is public. It's research for the public good, and it's research that is going to be made publicly available. At least that's the intent from the outset. And so we're able to work with a multinational team at MIT, which is really unique for us in the Air Force. And because of that, we really do focus on public data sets. There's ways for us to work on non-public data sets as well. But for the most part, and for this particular project, we do work with public data. Part of the project is going to be using existing data that we go out and collect and then curate and clean and ensure that it's something that we're able to actually do research on and model. And that takes a significant amount of time. Just as an aside, if you are looking at doing modeling using machine learning, your data scientist is going to be spending about 80 to 90% of the time just what we call data wrangling, just finding the relevant data and making sure that it is in a machine readable format that is relevant for what your use case is, and is standardized in a way that it is going to actually be processed and ingested as the input for an algorithm. It's really, really hard to do that. It's very time consuming and costly. But we also are able to rely on some public data sets. Most of them are coming from the government and academia. The one that this particular project uses is a really massive, very interesting data set called Severe. So it's a storm event imagery data set that this particular project is using. And that data set we've been able to refine, we've been able to add to it, and we pushed that out with a public challenge. And so each of our projects, we have about 13, 12, 13, 14 projects at any given time. And this is one of those. But each of those projects is required to come up with a public challenge. And as part of the public challenge, it is publishing a data set, typically having some starter code that is produced. So basically, it's copyright-free code that's able to be used to help actually do everything from extracting the data and able to actually start processing it, as well as kind of a baseline algorithm to start modeling, and a prompt, basically the problem that we're trying to solve. And so for this particular problem, we're using this Severe data set. And what that is, it's a large curated data set that has radar imagery. So a lot of video and images of radar. And what you're looking at is basically the sensors, and it's like hour-long segments. The challenge is to be able to look at the hour-long segment of radar imagery and come up with an algorithmic way to predict what that next hour is going to look like. And so that's the challenge. And so we push out this really interesting data set of weather radar imagery and this challenge with the starter code. And we invite really the rest of the world to take a stab at solving that problem, because it's very challenging.
So Andy, as one of the national security lawyers in this discussion, my ears perked up when you talked about the ITAR, sort of the International Traffic in Arms Regulation. And I thought it would be really interesting to kind of drill down a little bit in your role as chief legal counsel, sort of how your world intersects with weather forecasting, AI, algorithms, sort of what the universe of actually what you're doing with your legal hat on looks like in this space.
Sure. So that I'll say right off the bat, it's an incredible job. It definitely keeps me on my toes, and I feel very gainfully employed at the moment. And things like that. So that, like that question on ITAR, when it comes to research that the Air Force is conducting on mission relevant AI, it sounds really scary to national security lawyers. But this is part of a policy and really a national security strategy perspective. In fact, the national security strategy from this administration was just published last week. And in there, you'll see many times where it's talking about the role of public data and engaging not only just within the government, but in a whole nation effort to solve these big problems. And some of those are specifically discussed here is climate. And so how does the government interact with academia, interact with industry in a way that, and as well as our ally partners, in a way to solve these really big societal, not only American, but international problems. So weather is a great example of that. Each of our projects is going to be, by definition, a dual use case where there's a civilian as well as a military problem that's being solved. And so when it comes to how that decision is made, that's made at the outset, and we were very careful throughout the process. But we certainly treat that as an asset, that we're able to work with really the top minds in their various fields, regardless of their nationality. And they're very carefully scoped projects to ensure that we don't butt into any of those ITAR issues or other issues. But it allows us to, as I mentioned, really tap into phenomenal talent that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. But it also provides us in the Air Force that are at the Accelerator with some just unrivaled perspective when it comes to thinking through how do we apply AI to our problems? How do we conduct research in this area? How do we think about what it means to be using AI responsibly? And we get the whole panoply of perspectives just in our own organization. And we have weekly meetings with the principal investigators, the lab directors, the postdocs, the undergrad students, the researchers, and the airmen on the team. And we're able to discuss the progress that we made on the research is very collegial. And we're able to talk about these really fascinating issues like ethics in a way that is certainly enriching the people here. I think that goes both ways. That there's a lot of appreciation for the Air Force mission from the MIT faculty and students who probably wouldn't have had much exposure to that before. But between the academic perspective, the international perspective, and the various communities that the airmen that are part of the Accelerator come from. So I'm the lawyer. Out of the 13 airmen that we have permanently assigned to the Accelerator, there's 10 different career fields. So we have intel officers, we have pilots, we have cyber operators, ops researchers, as analysts. So really lots of different perspectives, lots of life experiences that are going to shade our opinions about this type of research that we're doing, about AI generally, about the societal impact of AI. And we're able to actually have great, friendly discussions that advance our knowledge and appreciation of this across the board.
So, I mean, I'm a research person myself, and my wandering into AI seemed pretty natural for a computer scientist. As a lawyer, as an attorney, someone trained in a completely different galaxy, what brought you to AI? Why? I mean, you're a PhD candidate now and with AI, and I'm wondering, how did you get there?
So I've always been just drawn to how the military, and really specifically the Air Force, for as long as I can remember, uses technology. And it's just a fascination. And I've been incredibly lucky in my Air Force career. I've been in for a little over 12 years now. I've had some great experiences in operations, in the courtroom, but primarily in government contracts. So I used to teach at the Army JAG School as a professor of government contracts. And during that time, I was able to work on basically while I was teaching, also consulting with various agencies within the federal government. Happened to start working on some of the first AI projects in the DoD. And it really just kind of lined up with my personal interest and able to allow me to, from my professional lens, this at the time very new technology. And you think about AI, we've heard about it for years, and much of what we know is really rooted in science fiction and this Hollywood sensationalism. But the state of the art as we know it, the emergence from the so-called AI winter really happened in 2012. And so that's after I started my Air Force career. And that's when machine learning really became the state of the art and such a powerful tool, because we had this convergence of really the three pillars of machine learning. We have very, very copious data coming from sensors all over the place. So you think about the Internet of Things, that's providing structured data that's very easy to derive insight from. And it's been able to improve its worth in the marketplace, and is starting to do so in the battle space now as well. You have incredibly fast and efficient and now fairly affordable, well, certainly relatively affordable computing power. And you have very optimized algorithms. And so all three of those come together to create the state that we're in right now, where AI is so powerful. But just a few years ago, it certainly wasn't. And when I was able to work on really some of the first AI programs in the DoD, that's what really focused me from just being generally appreciative and curious about a technology to being just completely all in and focused on a particular technology, because it's just AI is just such an interesting. It's not a technology; it's a ubiquitous technology enabler. It affects all other technologies, and so it has just impacts on all facets of society, private sector, public sector, and from a legal perspective, it doesn't matter what type of lawyer you are, you're going to touch AI. You're going to have to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty and understand, how does this technology work? Because there's legal questions, and it's really pushing the boundaries of what the law covers. We're seeing this across the world. The EU has been probably, in my opinion, leading in terms of trying to get ahead and understand and be proactive instead of reactive to the technology. Now, the EU is much more has a regulatory mindset than the US, which is much more of a open marketplace system. And so what they're doing might not translate particularly well to the US system, but it is really interesting to see. It is going to affect criminal law. It already has. It affects privacy, so First Amendment issues, Fourth Amendment issues. Contracts very clearly are implicated. One, in terms of AI for contracts, and contracts for AI are going to be more complex and require a different perspective and understanding than will be required for other types of supplies and services.
Well, and as the lawyers in our audience know, lawyers have an ethical duty to keep abreast of new technologies.
Right. We have a duty of competence to be able to advise and consult our clients and provide recommendations. And if you don't understand, how is this data interacting? Where's this data coming from? Where is it going? Who gets to see it? Those are all questions that are going to have important legal factors that need to be considered.
As you were talking about weather, I was thinking how important the weather was to the Wright brothers, and the fact that they chose Kitty Hawk in part because they wanted to have a certain kind of weather, but it varied from day to day as to what they were going to be able to do. But the developed world is covered with a rich web of weather sensors, as we know. But what about the developing world's weather, which I'm guessing is much less well measured, and is certainly, as climate change accelerates, parts of the developing world are getting stressed in the extremes, extreme drought, extreme storms that are predicted to be of one severity, and then several days later, as happened even in the developed world down in Sydney, I don't think they knew what they were in for when the floods hit recently. How does your research, do you think, when I say yours, I mean that going on at the AI Accelerator, hope to improve weather situational awareness around the world?
So, Roland, that's a huge problem, and your inclination is spot on. The developing world is much less represented by the types of sensors that were typically relied upon for weather forecasting. And so, how do you address that? And one way, as I mentioned before, is that global synthetic radar that's able to make sense of various sensor data from multimodalities and stitch it together to help create, it essentially appears to be a weather radar. It's synthetic, but it is pretty accurate and certainly better than nothing. Now, from an Air Force perspective, that's incredibly important, for the very basic reason of we operate globally, and we don't just operate in the developed world. And so we have our mission in those areas. And so we do need to understand what that weather is, because it affects the mission. From a broader picture, as you mentioned, weather and weather patterns and weather events is certainly a national security risk, but it's really an international security risk. And as you start to see these patterns develop of extreme weather events that are only increasing, that cause diasporas, it causes climate refugees, causes potentially famines, extinction events of critical wildlife and deforestation, fires. It causes obviously many issues. And the Air Force, probably the most recent example is Tyndall Air Force Base, which is a pretty critical training base down in Panhandle, Florida, was all but destroyed a few years ago by a hurricane and subsequent flooding. And so a lot of the climate action plan, and the Air Force just released its climate action plan a few weeks ago, one of the areas that it discusses is building resilient bases. And that certainly means within the United States, but also means really worldwide. From an Air Force perspective, it's really to ensure that it's able to conduct its mission regardless of the weather, or at least do the best it can to, in even extreme weather. But the types of research and the resulting technology and courses of action the Air Force is going to take to be able to meet that objective are going to have play a role in the other types of research, whether it's material research on like what types of like concrete or building materials are going to be able to withstand the types of pressures that are brought on by extreme weather events. That's all going to have an impact outside the Air Force as well.
So these defense developments that are producing benefits for the Air Force, do you think there are specific immediate spin-offs or benefits for civilian activities, whether it's forecasting weather for farmers or some of these large-scale early warning? Because I know for many of us, if we just go back 10 or 15 years, we didn't have the kind of warnings that we do now about when to start preparing for a hurricane. And we shouldn't overlook just how much progress has been made there. But I've never heard anybody say that progress was from AI. So I guess what I'm asking you is, can you talk about what specific civilian benefits you think will come from these AI weather projects that are going on at MIT?
So from the very pure weather problem perspective, AI is really good at detecting anomalies. And if you look at the way that weather has been predicted before, it's relying on historic data. And there might not have been that many anomalies in the past. And so is the historic data a good, relevant data set to use to predict? I think that's a interesting earth science question that is being addressed. And so looking at that is, okay, how can we also predict things that didn't happen before, unprecedented events? Well, one thing that machine learning is very, very good at is detecting anomalies. So identifying where the outliers are at, and if the data, the signal data that is coming in is, the algorithm's able to identify this is an outlier. Usually what it is able to do is able to basically label and bring it to an analyst to actually review it and make sure, yes, this is an outlier. Sometimes it's different, but you don't know what that means. And sometimes it's different enough, like we should look into this more. And that has various applications, but certainly in weather as well. So from the weather perspective, I think outlier detection is going to be really important in helping that particular issue. How do we get that early warning? And so that to me seems like a really powerful way that AI can help. And that goes to civilian as well as the Air Force. There's also a lot of ways where our severe data set that we're using, it's such a really interesting data set, and weather is such a classical statistical model. You think of, what does machine learning do? Well, it's a prediction, it's a statistical model. Well, what else do we know that we do that in? And it's weather. And so by using this classical model and this really large data set, we're able to run some other experiments that are going to really advance the state of the art of machine learning science just across the board. And so a couple of examples of that are explainability. One of the problems with advanced machine learning techniques like deep neural networks is these algorithms there's so many different parameters, and because yet the algorithms are being constantly rewritten by the data that is ingesting, you have this black box of a model where even the data scientists that create this algorithm are not necessarily going to be able to explain why it's making these types of predictions. And so a very large data set is used as a proxy to help understand ways to improve explainability for neural networks. And so that is going to have a profound impact on the way that we're able to, and really on the judgment call of whether we even use machine learning for a particular application. If it's higher risk, if we can't explain it, well, maybe we don't want to use it. There's a lot of types of cases certainly in the Air Force and defense context where maybe we just want to know what's going on for various reasons. Well, having an explainable model is really going to be helpful. Another way that this particular data set and just the context of this weather problem is being used is a way called few-shot learning. So few-shot learnings. So instead of having massive amounts of data to train a model, which is typically required, the old adage is that the more data, the more representative, relevant data that you have, the more accurate your model is going to be. Well, oftentimes, I should say, we just don't have all that data. We have what most would consider too small of a data set. Well, the idea behind the few-shot learning project, again, using this severe weather data set, is maybe if we are able to get really, really good examples that are very representative, very relevant to a very specific use case, say like 20, 25 great examples, that can actually result in an accurate model. Now, there's going to be other trade-offs with that, but it does kind of go against the grain in the traditional way of thinking about machine learning and just deep learning in general, that we need to have lots of data. Now, that's good for practical reasons. If you can't get a hold of all the data, you still want to be able to derive some insight and make some sort of prediction. And you also want to know about how accurate that prediction is going to be based on the limited data. But by doing that, you're actually saving a tremendous amount of cost and energy. One, in just coming up with all the data, but two, in the actual computation and the training of that model. Deep neural networks are notoriously power hungry, like extremely so. And so few-shot learning is able to address that. So we have AI to help inform us about weather, and we also have AI to help mitigate some of the weather, to the extent that there's contributions to the extreme weather patterns from industrial use cases and machine learning specifically, ways to mitigate that. And so that's also, of course, going to have a impact beyond just the Air Force.
This is, again, I keep saying this is fascinating, but it is. Many of the things you're talking about, potential benefits, and maybe this, maybe that. I don't want to sound like a funding agency, but how soon do you expect to see these kinds of things start trickling out and actually impacting daily lives?
So based on the type of research that we're doing, it is fundamental research. And so it is on the earlier stage of the technical readiness cycle. And really the reason why we're going to MIT is and Lincoln Lab is they're very fond of tackling the world's hardest problems. And so the Air Force did its best job to bring the world's hardest problems. And we kind of joke around that, what we do at the Accelerator is really make the impossible very, very difficult. And so some of the things that we're doing were thought to they are true discoveries. So we've had a few patents that have been filed. We have invention disclosures. We've also had over 200 publications that have pushed out our research to the public. Our public challenges, as I mentioned, are ways for us to take really interesting data sets, very hard and relevant problems, and invite the rest of the world to work on that. And we provide not only the data, but also the software, the starter code on our GitHub. And so that's open to the public. So we are working on really that early stage, and it's going to take other organizations, other universities and companies and individuals and governments to continue that research that we're doing and advance it. So, I'd like nothing more than to see the publications that the AI Accelerator has pushed out in the past couple of years. We've only been around since May of 2019 is when we were founded. We really didn't get funding for a few months later, and so the type of research that the team has been able to do is pretty great, considering so far I really only talked about one of the 12 or 13 projects. So we do have some that are farther, or from a technical readiness level. Most of our projects start at a 1 or 2 level. We have a few that are coming up to the 4 or 5 level, where we're actually doing some testing in operational environments.
I don't think I understand the numbering scheme.
Sure. Yeah. So the technical readiness level is just it's a shorthand way of describing where the technical maturity of a particular research project's at. And so most startups operate in the TRL 6, 7 world. Many university research is going to be in the 1 through 4 range. That's kind of where you see DARPA projects are going to be at that level. Programs of record for the DoD. So basically our systems acquisitions are going to be kind of in that 6, 7 level as well. And things that you just go out and buy are going to be in a TRL 9. That's kind of the end state where it's a proven concept. It works. It's repeatable. It's basically ready to go. And so it's a process for that. It aligns fairly well with our acquisition process. But the point of that is a lot of this is very early, and there's still a lot of work that remains in this area. It's no secret that this is very challenging work that our team is doing.
So Andy, as these projects that you're mentioning sort of progress, and as these true discoveries sort of come to fruition, I'm curious, can you give us a little bit of a snapshot into some of the ethical issues that you and your teams have been grappling with or seeing down the line as this technology emerges?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about the ethical issues and kind of from the AI Accelerator. So my relationship with MIT, and then we are plugged in and part of the ecosystem within the Department of Defense and their chief digital and artificial intelligence office as well. That's kind of the successor of the JAIC, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And they're the ones that are really working per the direction of the Deputy Secretary of Defense and Secretary Hicks on responsible AI. And so that's essentially the term that we're using to talk about the way that the Department of Defense is going to use AI. And so from a research perspective, we're looking at many different ways to ensure that it's the types of uses that we're really advancing are going to be able to be used reliably and are going to essentially do what their intended purpose is. We want to be able to understand why it's doing it, what it's doing, whether it's doing the intended purpose or the unintended. There's unintended activity as well. Want to be able to understand what does it need from the lawyer perspective, what types of data rights, what types of license into intellectual property from a commercial platform would the Air Force need to be able to ensure that it's adhering to its responsible AI tenets. And so We're looking at it from a kind of a research perspective, a policy perspective, a legal perspective, and certainly we discuss the broader societal impact as well.
Andrew, you mentioned interestingly that lawyers who are familiar, for example, with software acquisition projects are going to need to learn AI because they won't be the same. I think a question that's sort of hovering in the background. We know that DoD projects, acquisition projects, tend to take longer than the DoD or the taxpayer would like. They tend to cost more than anticipated. Is acquiring AI systems, are those going to take even longer? Or do you think we're going to get the upper hand in this acquisition process? Because I think there is concern that our peer adversaries are finding ways to do this faster. And in some areas, they're made strides ahead of us, and we have a catch up to do. And if we're going to take a long time to do it, we're not likely to catch up at all.
No, it's an excellent question. So I think this is probably an appropriate time to mention the standard DoD disclaimer that what I say here is really my opinions and may or may not reflect the positions of the Department of Defense or any of its organizations. And I say that as a preface of there's not really a written standard or DoD tagline on what this means, and so this is purely my opinion. But to answer your question, Roland, I certainly hope we don't take longer. I think time is of the essence for a couple of reasons. One, as you said, to maintain our competitive advantage, such that it is in AI. We do need to move with expediency, and the National Security Commission on AI that came out in March of last year, 2021, suggested that the United States is not ready to defend and compete in the AI era. And it gave us a 750 some odd page get well plan with the target of 2025 to do better. And much of that content is really describing how do we buy AI. It's not the only thing. That's not the only problem that the commission discussed, but it is certainly a big one. So acquisition in general has been studied and tinkered with for decades, certainly throughout my entire career and much longer before I started working in the federal government. And a lot on the lines of how do we get this right? Well, AI has really brought into the forefront how important it is to go fast. One, we have some serious competition in a way that we haven't had before in the form of China that is committed to leading the world in AI. And they're doing a really good job at ticking a lot of those quantitative boxes. And, we're still in many qualitative metrics, we're still leading, but we want to keep it that way, and being able to not only acquire AI, but there's a lot of work after you buy it to actually deploy it as well. And so, just buying it just one step, and so that from a contract perspective is unusual in that
Yes.
It requires a lot of coordination, it requires a lot of user feedback.
Plus, you need more maintenance work on an AI
Sure.
system.
Right. Well, maintenance or continuous development. It's hard to distinguish the two when we're talking about an AI system. And so where are you getting the data from? Is it, are we going to be continuously training it, or is it going to be a pre-trained model that we're just going to evaluate? Is the data is it all government owned data? Is it proprietary data? Is it open source data? All answers to those questions have serious acquisition impact. And from a acquisition strategy perspective, from a contract perspective, that's going to be important. And so, we should go faster. One, for just a pure national security reason, but we're also need to go faster because we're working with companies that are not the traditional companies that the Air Force is used to working with. So if you look at where AI innovation is coming from, you can see there are companies in Silicon Valley that are not part of the defense innovation group. They're the big like Googles and Amazons and Facebooks of the world, that they actually spend more on research and development for AI than the federal government spends on science and technology research. So there's this huge disparity, and they're not accustomed to going through the somewhat arduous, lengthy procurement cycles that the Department of Defense is known for. And so not to mention, this technology moves fast. You go through multiple iterations in a standard procurement cycle. And so you don't want to be buying obsolete technology. You want to be buying cutting edge technology. So speed is key. So we have these companies that are working in the US. And so how do we attract them? How do we align our contract practices to be able to, one, account for the technological concerns, but also the business concerns is going to be a challenge for us. And I'm happy to be part of the group looking into how do we get this right. And certainly that's basically what I described as the topic of my PhD thesis. So I've been thinking about this for a while now. I do think that contract law is a huge factor in the overall equation of how do we bring AI into the Air Force.
Well, Major Bowne, this has been a wonderful conversation. We very much appreciate your taking the time and walking the fine line between what you could tell us and what you couldn't. We hope to have you back sometime, because I think you mentioned that another area of your research is in navigation without relying on GPS satellites. And I think we'd be keen to hear about that if you can make time for us. But in the meantime, thank you so much. On behalf of all of us, thanks for being on this podcast with us.
Well, thank you. This has been my absolute pleasure.
We thank the Business Law section of the American Bar Association for their generous sponsorship of the production of this podcast. We welcome questions and comments from listeners. Send email to comments@mindthegapdialogues.com. We read all comments and questions and will try to respond in the letters section of a future episode. If you're writing about a particular episode, please mention the specific episode number. And please also include pronunciation tips to help us properly say your name when we reply in a subsequent episode. See you next time on Mind the Gap, Dialogues on AI.
Thank you for listening to the ABA Business Law Section's podcast series, To the Extent That. The section offers a robust collection of content. To explore more about this topic, or to learn about joining the section, visit ambar.org/bizlaw. That's BIZLAW.